What is up, my guys? This one is a video for my nerdy nerds because today I'm going to be talking about my reading statistics from 2023. So I do make this video every year and it's just essentially numbers, graphs, pie charts that represent my reading throughout the last year, things like my genres, where I'm sourcing my books from, ratings, and I also try and compare the statistics a little bit to previous years to see if there's anything kind of like noticeable going on there. So I am pretty much just going to jump straight into this because there is very little to it outside of that, and we are going to be kicking off with my Goodreads goal. So I did not hit my Goodreads goal again. This is the second year in a row I haven't hit my Goodreads goal, and in 2022 I definitely expected it. In 2023 I really did think I was going to get there. So last year I read 95 out of 101 books, like that was my goal. And the way that I set my Goodreads goal is that I always set it to one more book than I read the year previously. So for 2024 it's going to be 96 books. So in 2023 I read 5 less books than I read in 2022, but the interesting thing about this, and the reason why I'm not even slightly pressed about it, is because I actually read a significant amount more pages than I did in 2022. So my page count for 2023 was 42,157 pages, which is actually 3,266 pages more than I read in 2022. Now, this actually means that the books that I was reading last year are significantly longer on average than they were the year previous, as my average page length per book for 23 is 443, which is 54 pages more than it was in 2022. Now, I do generally read quite a few big books, but I feel like something that really contributed towards this statistic in 2023 was Wheel of Time. I read 6 books in the Wheel of Time series. The last one that I read was 993 pages long, and usually I feel like I do read enough shorter books that it balances out. Like my average length of book is normally somewhere around 350 pages, give or take around 30 pages, but my ratio, like my average, was really bumped up last year. And of course, like, pages mean more to me than books. Like, my Goodreads goal is not something I'm super pressed to achieve. It's just a little bit of a guideline for me, a little bit of a challenge, but overall I'm looking at the amount of pages I've read and valuing that more than the amount of books that I've read. So for the types of books that I've read, I still feel like I need a better title for this category, but this essentially represents how many books that I've read that are sequels, standalones, the first book in a series, or rereads. And 2023 was actually the first year that I split books in a series down into the first book and sequels, and that is because I definitely need to be reading more sequels than I am starting series, and that is actually a goal that I have for 2024 that I talked about in my 24 books to read in 2024 video. So I can't directly compare this to the year previous because I have changed the statistic a little bit, but I have read 7 more standalones in 2023. Something that I did notice is that if I had a choice between starting a new series or picking up a standalone, I was reaching for standalones a little bit more because I didn't want to be starting new series wherever possible. And I read 6 less rereads than I had the year previous, but in 2022 I did reread the entirety of Saga, which is a sci-fi comic series, and that definitely skewed my 2022 statistics. So I actually reread more in 2023 if we're talking about it from like an organic perspective, because I actually just generally reread for things, and I read slightly less books in series than I had the year previous. We were down 6%. For the books that I read per month, this is all over the place, and I feel, because I thought I was having a really good reading year, and I feel like I would have had an excellent reading year if I wasn't traveling a lot, because what we can see here is that I had 3 terrible months where I read, I think, was it 3 books per month, and that was May, July, and September. Now in May I went to New York for a week, in July I went to Colorado for a week, and in September I went to Croatia for a week and then Rome for a week, which obviously greatly impacted the amount that I was reading. I was doing other things aside from being at home with nothing to focus on apart from a book. On the flip side of that, having those reduced reading months in May, July, and September gave me like a reinvigorated perspective on reading for the months that immediately followed, because August and October were my best reading months ever. I think I read more than 5,000 pages in both of those months, which I have never ever done before. So it was very much up and down as opposed to being kind of steady like my reading normally is. And I feel like from a energy perspective and my attitude towards reading, this was potentially better than keeping on a level, because I feel like it added some more variety and also like made me more enthusiastic to read than I am on like a typical day. For my star ratings in 2023, I saw the fewest 5-star reads than I have ever had in all of my years of tracking my reading. I had 9 less than in 2022, which only accounted for 12 5-star reads overall. I did also have slightly less 2 stars. I had 3 less than the year previous, and I also had my first 1 star since 2020. Now, something that has cropped up over the last couple of years is my 3 and 4 star reads being almost neck and neck. Previously, 4-star was my like most frequently given out rating, but over the last couple of years it's like 3 and 4. Normally 4's just peaking out slightly, but they tend to be pretty level, and that is the same for 2023. For my demographics, everything is very similar to how it was in 2022. Over the last year, since I think 2021 or maybe 2020, we have seen a steady increase in the amount of adult that I've been reading and a decrease in YA, to the point where I was reading more YA than adult in 2020, and at this point I like adult is completely dominating. So I feel like we've got to a point where we've plateaued with this after steep increases for the last few years, because I'm actually 2% down on adult from last year, I'm down 4% on YA, and I have a 3% increase in new adult and a 1% increase in middle grade. So as you can see, all of those statistics are pretty negligible, and I feel like this is where my demographics are going to sit going forward, with it being about 75% adult, with YA being the next biggest piece of the pie, and then new adult and middle grade I feel can fluctuate very easily. For the formats, I was a little bit surprised because I expected to see a greater increase in audiobook listening this year. We actually only have a 3% increase on 2022. I did think about this because I was shocked that it wasn't a bigger increase, and I do actually think it's because the audiobooks I've been listening to are very long. So while I've been listening to around the same amount as I was in 2022, I'm listening to them for a lot longer. So I've been listening to the Wheel of Time series, which is taking me pretty much a month of that continuously being the audiobook I'm listening to. What I have noticed in 2023 is that I really like audiobooks now. I am still very picky. Like if I don't like a voice, I can be quite easily irritated by sound. So I have to really like the narration to be able to listen to an audio. I still very much prefer to listen to genres that aren't fantasy, unless I'm reading along at the same time, but I do like to listen to some fantasy and sci-fi audios as I'm reading the book if I'm struggling with focus or I really want to get locked in and absorbed in the story. We have a 13% decrease on graphic novels this year. That is because in 2022 I reread Saga, which really contributed to a boost in this format, and then everything else is pretty much the same. I have a 3% increase in arcs, which is 6 books that I read throughout the entire year, which is good because in my 2022 stats video, I was saying that I wanted to move away from arcs. I didn't like the culture and the behavior surrounding arcs. And while I'm not saying no to arcs forever, like don't ask me if I want an arc, I'm not going to accept it. I'm very picky about what it is that I accept, and it's stuff that I genuinely want to read. For these genres, we are going to see a knock-on effect that my enjoyment of audiobooks has had in this category. We just generally have more genres here than we usually do. The two I feel biggest introductions into this is we have a 3% increase in horror and also non-fiction, which isn't very much. I didn't read any horror or non-fiction in 2022, and I actually generally don't read non-fiction, or I didn't until recently. I actually really like non-fiction now, and it's because I like non-fiction audiobooks. I am not going to be like a non-fiction girly. I feel like where I really prioritize it, because my attitude towards non-fiction has always been I will read it if the topic is interesting to me, and if it isn't, I have no need to seek it out. Like I wouldn't make reading non-fiction a goal because I feel like that lacks purpose to me. If I wanted to say learn more about true crime or ingest more true crime, then I would make reading more true crime books a goal, but not non-fiction in general, because obviously the spectrum of non-fiction is pretty much infinite, and it has to be a topic that I have some interest in for me to be able to listen to it. I have been listening to a lot of memoirs. I find them very interesting. And then I also have a couple of things lined up that I've just picked up and I generally own, but also like some fitness non-fiction, and also some that are looking at like particular areas of society that I find fascinating. I have had a 8% increase in fantasy romance, which I am a little bit surprised about, because over the last year I haven't really been into romance, and I do feel like that there are hormonal reasons for that, and that is definitely represented in these statistics, because we have a 14% decrease on regular contemporary romance. And if it is hormonal, then it's just something that I'm gonna have to deal with. Like, I'm not as much of a romance girly anymore, and it is sad because it is something, like, it's a genre that I've only really discovered that I enjoy over the last couple of years. Fantasy is exactly in the same place where it was last year. We've had absolutely no change, and we've had an 8% decrease in sci-fi, which once again is accounted for by the Saga comics that I reread in 2022. For the places where I sourced my books from, I have absolutely nothing to report here. It is very much the same as it always is. We've had a 3% decrease in my own TBR and a 3% increase in the books that I've hauled. Very minimal changes, like things that can fluctuate very easily. Like 3% is represented by like 2 books, I think. And then the other like 13% of books that I read that aren't ones that I've hauled and haven't come from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of the year. This very much fluctuates on a case-by-case basis between Kindle Unlimited, Scribd, Audible, NetGalley, although NetGalley isn't actually something that I ever really use anymore. So I think, did I read anything? 2 NetGalley books last year. For me to go onto NetGalley and request it, it has to be a super hyped release for me, I feel. Like, I think one of my NetGalley books was Loved Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood for the last year. But yeah, we don't really have anything to report here. My books that I'm putting on my TBR versus the ones that I'm reading from my TBR, also very little to report. I put 66 books on my TBR and I read 65 of them. This was something that was very relevant when I was doing Bookopoly TBRs, like whether I was actually getting to everything on my Bookopoly TBR in the month. Now the only books on my TBR are ones that I have to read for book clubs or like Patreon stuff, so I am definitely going to be reading them, and it's very unusual for me to not, because it's like a, I don't know, it's an obligation. Like, it's gonna get done. It might take me a while, but it's definitely gonna get done, you know? So I feel like this statistic is almost obsolete at this point. Something else that has very little change is my author relationship. So essentially, are they authors that are new to me or ones that I've read from before? We have a 2% increase in authors that I've read from previously, and a 2% decrease in new authors, like authors that are new to me. I never really know where I want to balance this, because I am a completionist at heart, and so I want to read everything from authors that I enjoy, but at the same time I don't want to become stagnant. Like, I want to be exploring and finding new things. I feel like for me though, it's always going to be skewed heavily towards the known category, because I do like to, like, if I find an author I like, I want to read their entire backlist. So there is no like preferable balance of this, and I don't foresee this really shifting too much in the future either. And then the final statistic we have, I'm not going to go through the entire thing because it is the publishing wheel. So these are all of the publishers that I've read from in the last year. I do actually have a little bit of fluctuation here. We have a 9% decrease in indie books or self-published books that I've been reading. There's probably a couple of things responsible for this. The first one is that with the hype of book talk and romance and fantasy romance, a lot of indie series have been picked up by publishers. However, where I have the indie copies, I mark them as indie unless the copy that I physically have is the traditionally published version. And then on top of that, like I said, I haven't been reading very much romance, and the majority of indie books that I read are from the romance genre. We have a 7% decrease in Harper Voyager, which is normally my second biggest piece of the pie. So of the 3 biggest fantasy publishers in the UK, Voyager is the one that I typically read the most from. However, this year it's actually Orbit with 13%, and I think that this is because the Wheel of Time books are published by Orbit, and similarly the First Law books are published by Galanx, and I have a 3% increase in Galanx books that I've read in 2023. So where I have 2 like high fantasy, epic fantasy book clubs going on. The majority of the fantasy that I'm reading is from those series which are published by Glance and Orbit, which I think has contributed to a decrease in the amount of Harper Voyager books that I'm reading. We do have a 12% decrease in Image, which is the publisher, the comic publisher that publishes Saga, so we can see why that was so high in 2022. And also a 9% increase in Penguin, which is interesting. I'm not really sure why. Is that because I've been reading more genres outside of my usual, more non-fiction, more thrillers, more horrors, a little bit of literary fiction? That could potentially be why we have so many more Penguin books than usual here, because Penguin's normally like Simon & Schuster and HarperCollins is like a very minimal part of this chart. So that is pretty much all of my 2023 statistics. I do feel like at this point we may start to see these videos like plateau a little bit with very negligible fluctuations between the different like categories that we have here. Depending on my mood, I shift between whether I want lighter reads or heavier reads. I shift between whether I want to dive into something that feels new and different like thrillers, horrors and non-fiction, or whether I want to like just stay in my fantasy lane. And also I feel like I always read a lot of like real good, real gritty, real big meaty fantasy, and then I kind of get a little tired of it, a little fatigued with it, and I'll go and read some things that are more like romance heavy and then come back and like be really eager to explore new series. And that's the point where I'm at now. So I think for 2024 in particular, you are going to find me reaching for a lot of fantasy and looking for some new series to get obsessed with, especially because something that is quite upsetting is my lack of 5 stars recently and them decreasing every year. I did talk in my best books of the year how with things like fantasy, it's just I'm generally a lot more experienced in fantasy and a lot pickier than I have been in the past. So we are gonna see those 5 stars in fantasy in particular become a little bit more rare. But I do feel like I also don't pick up the stuff that I really think I'm gonna love all that often, whether it's because I feel I don't have time, I have other stuff on, or it intimidates me in the case of some of like the thicker adult fantasy series. And I really feel like the mood that I'm in right now, I want to get into like a fantasy zone a little bit more in 2024. So I hope you guys enjoyed my 2023 statistics. Down in the comments, let me know how many 5 stars you had in the last year. I think that would be really interesting to find out. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Candle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go when nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.